Now with your fish, it's really important that you understand what a fish should look like.
Yep.
And if they've got a big belly on them, then you've got to reduce the food. So if we look at the belly of, say, this white fella, for example.
Yep. He's the one growing the fastest.
Yeah, he's got a very fat belly. So basically the quality of your fish is exactly equal to the quality of your water, which we can test.
Yeah.
And also the quality of your food.
Yeah.
So high quality food gives high quality fish. Obviously low quality food gives low quality fish. It's sort of that simple.
I'll say one thing to you. I suspect they get a lot of their nutrition from, they eat this all the time.
Well, absolutely. And you'll find fish in a low populated situation like this, where there is exposure to outside, they almost don't need to be fed.
Yeah.
So a pond like this, I would probably feed them maybe once a week.
Oh.
And that's only because that's going to give you a relationship with the fish.
Yeah, no, they certainly, we have a relationship. No,
yeah, if you don't ever feed them, then they don't sort of value you like they do when you feed them.
Yeah.
But in saying that, you don't really need to feed them that much. No, I'm fine. I'm all good. Isn't that cool? So yeah, if you cut the food down to nearly nothing compared to what you're feeding.
You'll hate what I feed them. Normally, until summer, I fed them once every other day about a fingerful. But I've been feeding them daily, but they're the guys who keep the stones clean.
Sure. Now one thing I would definitely do here is get myself a flipper, and a flipper is a magnet cleaner, and the magnet cleaner is going to keep the front nice and clean, because there's quite a lot of diatom growth at the front. Yeah. And as far as algae is concerned, you've got all this algae flaked off at the bottom, which looks like it's died off. But the thing about algae is that when the algae dies off, all it does is release its nutrients back into the water and then causes more algae. Yeah. So what you really want to do is get yourself like a fine net and try and scoop out as much of that you can. Yeah, or you can get a vacuum and vacuum it all out, but removing it is really the key. So the water goes out of the aquarium and goes down this lovely big waterfall. Now this lovely big waterfall, if running all the time, will actually be a very, very good biological filter, because lots of bacteria is going to grow on this porous surface, and it's going to be heavily oxygenated, which means it's going to break down fish waste very, very well. Then from there it goes into here, where a lot more good bacteria is going to grow, and then we've got the pond at the bottom. So biologically, this pond would likely be actually quite good. Oh, nice thunder. So down here we could look at putting some temperate water fish, things like sucking cats, mountain clouds, zebra danios, rosy barbs. They're all some species that would likely do very well in here, and then that would give us a little bit of a distinguishing factor between the temperate water fish down here. We could even think of things like Tandennis catfish, and then we can have the goldfish upstairs, and that would be very cool. So there's a pit pump here that pumps water up to the filter at the top. Yep. And there is a UV sterilizer that we're hoping to run on that unit. Yeah. Now the only disadvantage, which doesn't look too bad, is that would be a hell of a lot of back pressure on the UV. So we're just going to have to consider that, because that's relatively cheap plastic to house a lot of back pressure, because that's going to have a whole lot of back pressure on it. The water flow doesn't look extreme, but the thing about a UV is if the water goes really fast through the UV, then the UV doesn't really work. So I don't really think that's your problem. But the issue I'm slightly worried about is that's not really high quality to run something with a whole lot of back pressure. So it just may It'll just be interesting to see how long that lasts. And the UV tube needs to be replaced every 1 to 2 years, sort of closer to 1 year. Now this pond is very low stocked, so therefore water changing is not super important, because when he's doing the backwashes, there are water changes. Oh, there's a UV. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, but it's very low.
Is it actually working?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so hang on. So it does that. Okay, so there is a UV there.
But it's got a very low flow rate.
Okay, but a low flow rate on a UV isn't necessarily bad.
Oh, okay.
So do you know how old the tube is in it?
No, you replaced the battery, the bulb in that 6 months ago.
Okay, so that would be all good, because your water is relatively clear.
Yeah, I reckon.
So I think the UV is doing something.
Yeah, the water has always been clear.
So therefore you would assume the UV is actually working then. Otherwise your water would likely be green.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I think your UV is actually doing something. Okay, that's good news. I think just getting a lot of all that sediment out of the bottom,
Yeah.
cut your food down,
No, I've got
and away you go.
several take-home messages already.
Is the filter that runs the aquariums, and the aquarium is just up here, and then the pond is down 6 meters down. So basically if we looked at replacing these fittings and then we replaced it with pipe that they've already got downstairs and installed the UV sterilizer, it's going to be way better to have the UV sterilizer here than it is to have the UV sterilizer downstairs, because the UV sterilizer is going to cop all the pressure of that big pit pump, and the pressure is going to go straight into an elbow and straight into an elbow, so that would lose a lot of pressure and put a lot of pressure on what is effectively fairly cheap plastic. So up here we wouldn't have the same issues, and the other thing is that we can easily mount it to make sure that the UV stays full. What you don't ever want to do is mount the UV up, so then as soon as you turn the UV off it's empty. If the pump is not running, it'll be empty, and you never want to run a UV when the UV is empty, otherwise the UV, if there's no water in it, will quickly damage the plastic and split the UV. So when you mount a UV, you want to mount a UV either upside down or sideways, so the return in and out are high, so the UV is always full of water. Even if you turn off your UV, you want your UV to be full of water. You don't want to have a situation where you turn your pump off, then your UV goes empty, then you turn your UV on, and your UV is on with no water. Otherwise the UV will actually degrade the plastic really quickly and split it. So this here looks, yeah, that all looks, so it's just a matter of changing that fitting there and probably that fitting there. With a UV sterilizer, if we're talking about something like a 36 watt UV sterilizer, for a pond run with relatively higher water flow, therefore thicker pipe, then it's much more correctly termed as a clarifier. So therefore what it'll do is the water will pass through it and algae will be killed by the UV. But if we use that same unit, but we slow the flow right down, and then often you're using the thinner pipe, then the contact time of the UV tube is much higher, and that would give it an ability to sterilize. And if it sterilizes, it's going to be killing parasites and bacteria and other things like that. So it's got to be over 18 watts, and it's got to be run with slow flow. And then a clarifier can be a sterilizer. But in general, a sterilizer is run much slower, and a sterilizer generally is a much thinner bodied, so there's much higher contact with the actual UV tube. So running slower flow is going to be compensation for that. Now, we always have to consider water flow in reference to the water through our pumps. And in general, the water through pumps and filters, normally you want to have a slower due to increased contact time. But as far as water flow in the pond or aquarium is concerned, what you're really trying to achieve is a bit of what they call kinetic energy. So in a perfect world, for a situation like this, we could have some sort of pump, and what we want to do is create some movement of the water. But the key is to create movement of the water so that the movement of the water creates the movement of the water. So that's kinetic energy. So when you put a bit of kinetic energy into a pond, you can do it with literally one pump. The idea would be to have the pump up near the surface so it agitates the surface. In this case, you'd sort of want it down there where it's not going to impede our view. And the idea would be to get the water moving around. And what that would really do too is help to dislodge all this sort of stuff, because there's massive amounts of sediment and algae on the bottom. So doing a good gravel clean is going to help. And doing the gravel clean on a big long hose to put it down the side of the house is a great way of using gravity. Using a fish net just to scoop all of the crap out is also going to help. There's also various vacuums available. And reducing your food's going to help, because these little fatzos here are pretty much eating all day, because goldfish actually don't have a stomach. They've just got a long intestine. So they pretty much spend all day foraging. So you don't need to feed these things a lot. You feed them just enough so they've got a little bit of a belly on them. And in a pond, I typically feed them once a week. And that's, once again, not because the fish necessarily need the food, but just for my relationship with the fish. And then I would normally feed them what they eat in 30 seconds. And I want all the food to be gone in 30 seconds. And then my favorite two foods is Spectrum's probiotics. And the reason why I like Spectrum's probiotics is the food has got a probiotic bacteria in it, which means that when the fish poo, the bacteria in the poo eats the poo. So it really helps to keep the pond nice and clean, or the aquarium nice and clean. And the other food I really love is Danichi, and that's because it's not processed, it's not pressure cooked, it's holistic, it's like just really, really high quality food. The probiotics from New Life Spectrum is also not processed or pressure cooked, because most fish food is just processed crap in a can. What you're looking for is something holistic, something not processed, not pressure cooked, and you'll absolutely see the difference with your fish, and you'll find that you really, really don't need to feed them much. The cheaper your quality food, in general, the more they need to eat to maintain condition, and the messier the food tends to be. So getting a bit of water flow in here is going to be absolutely wonderful. Regardless of your aquarium or pond, something that I highly recommend that you do on a semi-regular basis is to bring a sample of water down to Majestic Aquariums so we can check the water, and also to bring a little video so we can see what's going on. Now, as far as fish food's concerned, that is processed crap, and that is very high quality. Fish food is 50% of fish keeping. Use good food, it makes a massive, massive difference. With the setup like this, if you're just doing a little bit of a top up, particularly considering this has a filter that requires backwashing, a little bit of a top up, let's say 5 or 10%. If you don't use Water-Ager, your risk as far as chlorine and that is relatively low. But then if you start doing gravel cleans and vacuums and you start sucking more of the pond out of the water, then you're going to have to think about using Water-Agers, because as you put the water back in again, you're going to be introducing chlorine and chloramone, which can be risky. So make sure that you're using Water-Agers. Now, the other thing is that there are various products that you can consider just to help scavenge and clean up this bottom. Something like, for example, water cleanser. So water cleanser are these little balls, and you just throw them in. And what the water cleanser does is allow the growth of what's called OEMs, or oil-eating microorganisms, that are very powerful scavengers. And they come alive and they basically eat anything organic and really polish the water up. And then they'll really bloom, and they'll be completely microscopic, so you won't see them. then when they run out of food, they will sort of die off. They're not something that tends to survive without a hydrocarbon as a food source. So there are various biological things that you can do. And once we've got your water checked and we make sure the GH and KH is good, then we'll start seeing big improvements. Now these little strip tests, they're sort of better than nothing. I wouldn't be holding them as a gospel. I'd probably recommend bringing a sample of water down to Majestic, just let us check on it. But going by this test here, first of all, on this side, we've got nitrate, which is NO3. Now, NO3 is 3rd degree fish waste. Nitrate basically tells us if there's enough water changes going on. And because there's not many fish in the pond and there are plants to absorb the nitrate, the water changes that are occurring through the backwash for the amount of fish at the moment are okay, because your nitrate's very low. If your plants start looking a bit not green, you could even consider increasing your nutrients because the plants will actually use it. Now, nitrite is 2nd degree fish waste, so that's a representation of whether the filter is working. That's NO2, so the NO2 breaks down into NO3. Your NO2 is 0, as I would expect, because in reality, this pond is very well filtered for very few fish. Now, the pH really looks okay. It's hard to look at that color, but I'm sort of saying something around 7. So that's acceptable. Your KH, according to this, looks acceptable as well. I use DKH, but that looks like it's around 60, I'd be guessing, which is really quite acceptable. I just definitely don't want that 0. Then your GH is looking a little bit on the high side, but not too bad. If your GH gets too high, you find your plants start to struggle. So you might want to do some extra water changes to get your GH down. If your pH is too low, you can add a bit of coral or calcium, bit of coral grit into the pond. That will help with that. And there are supplements as well. But going off these levels, which I have no reason not to believe, I think your water quality is quite good. Yeah. But I wouldn't be 100% confident about that until I'd tested it with my proper test. But looking at the fish and looking at the environment, I have no reason not to believe this. Yeah. And I have no reason to believe that's not a healthy environment. But in saying that, we could improve it. Now, with your plants, if your plants are growing, it's not broken, you don't have to fix it. But on the other hand, if you do find your plants are looking a little bit yellow, you can consider increasing the amount of fertilizer, iron-based fertilizers. But you never want to increase your iron-based fertilizers if your general nutrient levels are high. Otherwise, the iron-based fertilizers are going to make your algae go stupid. So if your nutrients are under control, as in nitrates and phosphates, and you're feeding high-quality foods, your pond's well filtered, and you don't have too many fish, then you could consider putting in iron-based fertilizers, and they can help your plants. But once again, you don't want to do that under the wrong circumstances and make your algae go nuts.